Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hello, guys. Okay, time to learn about the Irish, English, Irish, British tensions in the 20th century. Well, I guess further back than that. So, ready to learn. How you guys doing? Hope you're doing well. So my father's side of the family can be traced back to a town called Mohill, Ireland. My mother's side back to Lancashire, England. So I'm kind of on both sides here, I guess. So yeah, I'm ready to learn. You guys are great, helping me out with stuff I don't understand. Let's get started. If you are not ready to learn, there's the door. You know the drill. Home X down the hall. You are in the wrong class. Let's go.
1916 as World War I on Easter Monday 1916 as World War I raged in Europe. An event took place in Dublin that would change the course of Irish history. Determined to throw off British rule, over 2,000 men backed by around 300 women rose up in armed revolt. In a flurry of activity, they seized key government buildings, set up a perimeter around the city centre, proclaimed the birth of an independent Ireland. For those on the nationalist side, it was a glorious moment, a transformative event that would reawaken Irish consciousness after over a century of British rule. It was also doomed to end in complete disaster. Intended to be the trigger for a series of uprisings, the Easter Rising instead failed to spark anything but an almighty British backlash. For near 7 days, Dublin City became a war zone, its cobblestones chipped by sniper fire, its old buildings bombarded by artillery. By the time the smoke cleared, the Rising's leaders would all be prisoners. Yet somehow, this failed revolt would wind up becoming one of the key steps on the road to Irish independence. As legendary as it was disappointing in 1916, this is the tale of the Easter Rising when Dublin erupted.
Do it. Time to learn. I'm gonna have to, pause where I.
In the end, it was an inconclusive election that did it, or rather, two inconclusive elections held nearly 35 years apart that together would set the stage for Dublin to explode. The reason? Two simple words that nonetheless held the key to so many Irish dreams: Home Rule. Back on the 1st of January 1801, the Acts of Union had officially come into force, merging the kingdoms of Britain and Ireland into a single nation, the UK. Trouble was, the vast majority of Irish people found this merger about as appealing as a personal lap dance from King George himself. While Ireland had been dominated by its bigger neighbour for centuries, now the Union made that one-sided relationship painfully official. The Parliament in Dublin...
Sorry, I always see Ireland as a cute little birdie, like flying. See, like its eye and its little wing and its tail feathers and its claws, right? Sorry.
Made that one-sided relationship painfully official. The Parliament in Dublin was abolished. The island instead assigned 100 MPs to sit in Britain's House of Commons, a number dwarfed by the 500 plus MPs from the rest of the UK. So even though Catholics were, from 1829, enfranchised by the new system, the overall effect was to leave Ireland voiceless in her own affairs, a situation made grimly clear by the London government's woeful response to the Great Famine. But while Irish independence movements did spring up, the reality was that the idea was a non-starter. The Acts of Union were written to be permanent, and there was just too many, mostly Protestant Irish, who felt their destiny was to remain a part of the UK. Home Rule was theoretically above nationalism and unionism, a simple transfer of some minorish powers to Dublin, allowing Ireland to make necessary local reforms on stuff like land. But while the movement had some early successes, 1885 would see it transformed into the political equivalent of nitroglycerin. That year, a UK election saw the Liberal Party under William Gladstone win the most seats, but fall short of a majority. That meant Gladstone's only path to power was to convince Ireland's MPs to back him, the majority represented by the Irish Parliamentary Party under Charles Stewart Parnell. And Parnell wanted one thing in return: Home Rule. And just like that, Home Rule went from a compromise to the most divisive thing in politics. The crazy idea that the Irish people might have some say on Irish affairs seemed to have given Britain's establishment a collective shot of panicked racism. In Ireland itself, those who supported the Union came to see it as the first step towards an unforgivable betrayal, the beginning of a slippery slope leading to nationalists forcing them all to drink Guinness and worship the Pope. To use a modern analogy, Home Rule in this era was like a supercharged version of Brexit or Roe versus Wade, a cultural flashpoint that burns brighter than a nuclear detonation. Luckily for opponents, though, it was also something else entirely.
So, guys, so the whole of Ireland was a part of Great Britain. I'm curious to learn how most of Ireland became independent, but England or the UK still held on to the Northern Ireland part. I'm curious to learn that.
Utter fantasy. There simply wasn't the will in Britain to let it happen. Gladstone's first vote in 1886 was killed by defectors from his own party. Even when he finally got the Commons to successfully vote for Home Rule several years later, it was killed in the Lords, Britain's unelected and extremely conservative second chamber. In a weird way, though, this helped keep a lid on things. So long as the fussy old farts in the Lords kept their veto power, Home Rule could never be enacted. So folk in Ireland just kind of resigned themselves to remaining a part of the UK. But then the second inconclusive election arrived and blew that lid clean off. In 1909, the Liberals, now under H.H. Asquith, faced a crisis when the Lords blocked their people's budget, a kind of British New Deal with way more top hats and terrible teeth. So Asquith called an election, promising to remove the Lords' veto power if he won. Instead, the 1910 election produced a deadlock, one that even a second election that year couldn't resolve. With just one seat more than his Conservative rivals, Asquith's dreams and budget appeared to be toast, unless he could find another party to support them. Like Gladstone before him, Asquith at this stage turned a big smile to the Irish Parliamentary Party and its leader, John Redmond, and basically said, "I say, old bean, I've got a spiffing idea. How about your lot vote for my budget, and I'll have my chaps back your Home Rule thingy? Yes? What? It was 1885 all over again, a British Liberal government propping itself up with appeals to Irish dreams. This time, though, the arrangement would throw the whole of Ireland into chaos. Although Asquith's focus was on passing his budget,
We noblemen, barons, knights, gentlemen, citizens, burghers, ministers of the gospel, and commons of all sorts in the kingdoms, England and Scotland and Ireland, by the providence of God, living under one king and being of one reformed religion, having before our eyes the glory of God and the advancement of the kingdom of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
Although Asquith's focus was on passing his budget, the effect of his deal with John Redmond was to blow up all the old certainties surrounding British rule in Ireland. True to his word, Asquith allowed a vote on Home Rule. As with Gladstone's second attempt, it passed, and once again the Lords then took a gigantic dump all over it. But this time it was different. The year before, 1911, the Liberal Parliament had axed the Lords' veto, replacing it with the ability to block legislation for a mere 2 years. That meant that the new Home Rule Bill would de facto come into force in 1914. For Irish nationalists and moderates, this was all like, "Well, lads, time for a bit of the old crake." Sorry for my terrible Irish accent. Celebrations broke out. John Redmond was hailed a hero. For Unionists, though, the 1914 date wasn't a cause for celebration. It was a deadline, the point at which they felt their way of life would be obliterated if they didn't act now. That September 1912, 500,000 Unionists under Sir Edward Carson gathered in Belfast to sign the Solemn League and Covenant with an implied threat of violence if Home Rule was implemented. Shortly after, the Ulster Volunteer Force was formed, a paramilitary group dedicated to stopping Home Rule by war, if necessary. They were a huge force. Not only that, they were supported by the leader of the UK opposition, future Conservative PM Andrew Bonar Law. By the fall of 1913, Carson would feel so comfortable that he was able to threaten the creation of a new Ulster government should Home Rule be allowed to go ahead. It was a challenge the nationalists couldn't let go unanswered. Across 1913 and 1914, militias began forming in and around Dublin as committed to protecting Home Rule as the Ulster Volunteers were to blocking it. The Irish Volunteers were the first to coalesce, but they were soon followed by others, including James Colony's Irish Citizen Army and the all-female Cumann na Mban. It was the paramilitarization of Irish society, each side scrambling to get enough fighters and guns to battle for the coming future. By spring 1914, civil war was clearly looming. Panicked, Asquith's government ordered the military to enforce Home Rule in the event of a unionist uprising, only for swaths of Ireland-based officers to declare they'd abandon their posts if told to take action. It was a genuine crisis, one that threatened to spill over into bloodsheds that would tear both Britain and Ireland apart. Fortunately, Europe chose that precise moment to explode. The beginning of World War I threw everything happening in Ireland into a strange, unexpected limbo. Remember back in March of 2020 how the coronavirus, gleefully bouncing around on the world stage, swept aside all other major stories and events? Well, that was World War I in 1914. Before Britain had even declared war on Germany, the implementation of Home Rule was suspended. Just days later, the UK government was too busy with the conflict to think about the Ireland Bill anymore. Nor were they the only ones. The wave of patriotism that marked the start of the Great War swept Ireland too. Unionists signed up to fight in the British Army, but so did Home Rulers. John Redmond actually travelled to 32 countries, encouraging those who supported Home Rule to enlist, certain the British government would reward their loyalty. In all, 300,000 would respond from across the divide. 300,000 young men who might otherwise have fought for a militia suddenly were sent off to shoot Germans in wartime Europe. And just like that, the tension drained from Irish politics. The looming conflict suddenly put on hold in face of a greater catastrophe. But not everyone was happy with this outcome. Barely had the war even begun before plans started to be laid, plans not to ensure that Home Rule was implemented, but to skip straight to declaring Ireland an independent republic. So there's an old nationalist saying that goes, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. And as World War I got underway, it quickly became clear that England was in a whole lot of difficulty. For Thomas Clarke, the news couldn't have been sweeter. A member of the secretive IRB, or Irish Republican Brotherhood, Clarke was a guy who hated British rule almost as much as he hated people spelling whiskey without the E. Since 1907, it operated out of a shop in Dublin, where he and Seán Mac Diarmada had established a network dedicated to revolution. Now, as Europe went up in flames and Britain poured its men and money into the conflict, the two saw a golden opportunity. Within 2 weeks of London declaring war on Berlin, they'd convinced the IRB's Supreme Council to agree to stage a revolt. 1 month later, on September the 9th, Clarke called a secret meeting at the Gaelic League's library. There he and Mac Diarmada were joined by 5 men whose names would soon go down in history: Thomas MacDonagh, Patrick Pearse, Eamon Seint, James Connolly, and Joseph Plunkett. These are the guys who less than 2 years later would form the core of the Easter Rising. On that fateful day, though, they merely agreed that the war formed the perfect backdrop for overthrowing the British, which led to an obvious thought: why not partner up with the Germans to do it? That November, the human rights campaigner Roger Casement arrived in Berlin, tasked with securing military backing for the rising. But this would be harder than imagined. While the Germans were all like, revolt against die English Schweineheit? Das is a fantastic idea, yes? But they didn't think it was so fantastic they wanted to commit money to it. Even when Joseph Plunkett came to help Casement in early 1915, detailing a plan to capture Dublin while the Germans landed 12,000 troops in Limerick, the Kaiser's high command still didn't bite. There were just too many ways that it could all go horribly wrong. But they did eventually agree to supply some weapons. Not many, but significantly more than the couple of thousand rifles the IRB could currently get its hands on. For Clarke and co., it was enough to start taking their plans to the next stage. This planning had to be in absolute secrecy, not to keep the British from finding out, but to keep other Irish nationalists from freaking the out. The IRB, you see, didn't really have its own militia. Instead, it focused on infiltrating and radicalizing pre-existing organizations like the Irish Volunteers, then the biggest nationalist fighting force in Ireland. The problem was the Volunteers' Chief of Staff, McNeill, was the sort of guy who'd rather wipe the king's butt crack with the Irish tricolour than send his men into a battle that they weren't guaranteed to win. And even with the German weapons, there's no guarantee any rising wouldn't end in failure. The next few months, then, were spent trying to get things into position without letting either Eoin MacNeill or the British know what was happening. Soon, a rough plan had formed to get the volunteers used to mustering in force for drills that could be turned into the real thing at a moment's notice. At the same time, a date was set for the Germans to land weapons on the coast, and a day agreed for the rising itself, Easter Sunday, 1916. That day, Patrick Pearse would summon the Irish volunteers for drills across the country. But rather than just marching, they'd instead be handed guns. Key buildings in major cities like Dublin and Cork would be seized, and a signal would be sent out for all Irelands to rise up against the hated British. The cleverest part? By now, everyone was so used to the volunteers holding marches and drills that they wouldn't suspect a thing until it was too late. On April the 17th, 1916, the plan was finalized. A draft proclamation was written declaring an Irish Republic. Sadly, though, the rising was doomed to end in failure. None of the 7 men who signed the proclamation knew it yet, but they'd all just signed their own death warrants. The collapse of the Easter Rising happened before a single shot was fired. On the night of April the 20th, just 3 days before it was due to begin, Eoin MacNeill discovered the plot and set about furiously trying to stop it. There was just too little chance of success, too great a chance their cause would be damaged by the failure, especially when you consider the other news coming in that night. At 3 a.m, a German U-boat landed Roger Casement and 2 companions on the coast, only for them to be arrested before they could make contact with the RB. Just hours later, German ship the Ord arrived off the coast carrying 20,000 rifles, only for the British to capture it. Suddenly, MacNeill was facing the doomsday scenario of his men being asked to fight without weapons, without German backing, in a rising the British were now aware of. So, rather than let it take place, he torpedoed the whole thing. On Saturday night, MacNeill issued an urgent order to the Irish volunteers, effectively telling them to stay home and not get involved in any dumbass schemes. But it was such a catastrophic hit that the IRB's military council pulled the plug. Easter Sunday came and went, with Ireland tense but peaceful. The only sign anything was afoot was a secretive meeting being held at Liberty Hall. Behind closed doors, the rising 7 ringleaders weighed their options. Rather than give the whole thing up, they decided to push ahead the next day, even if the odds of failure were 99%. The fact even a 1% chance of success existed was thanks entirely to British bungling. Now the British captured Casement and all the German guns. Rather than being all like, suspicious, let's investigate further, they were more like, well, that takes care of that, doesn't it? No need to make any more military preparations. Anyone want any tea? As Easter Monday dawned, key sites across Dublin were virtually unguarded. Many officers weren't even in the city, but watching the horse races. It's this jaw-dropping negligence that gave the Rising's leaders their one secret weapon: surprise. Around 11 a.m, members of the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens' Army began to muster, their numbers swelling to around 1,500. Then, armed with rifles, shotguns and revolvers, those men began to march. As noon approached, the militia spread across Dublin. Buildings like the GPO were seized, armed positions taken up on St. Stephen's Green. Bridges were secured. As the British sat back, blissfully unaware, a cordon was drawn around the city centre, a line of rebellion that would soon separate daily life from the chaos about to erupt. Around noon, unarmed DMP Constable Michael Lahiff was shot dead, becoming the Rising's first victim. Rebels began to swarm outside Dublin Castle, the nerve centre of British rule. City Hall was attacked. At 12:45, Patrick Pearse stood on the steps of the GPO and read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic. As the tricolour and a green flag were hoisted behind them, he declared, "Irishmen and Irishwomen, in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to take her flag and strikes for her freedom." It was a powerful speech, an iconic moment in history. Yet even as Pearse made his proclamation, the Rising was already falling apart. Across the river, the attack on Dublin Castle was being repulsed, as was another on an important British arms cache. Worse, the rebels had failed to secure either the railway station or the docks. That meant that when the time came, the British would be able to move in reinforcements by the thousands. But perhaps saddest of all, the Rising had failed to take off elsewhere. Despite a small turnout in Wexford and Galway, most volunteers had obeyed Eoin MacNeill's order to stay home. Rather than an island-wide rebellion, the leaders were instead backed by only a handful of Dublin radicals. Hopeful as Pearse
Mixed messages there. Okay.
rebellion, the leaders were instead backed by only a handful of Dublin radicals. Hopeful as Pearse's pronouncement was, it was also a eulogy. The backlash was already coming, and when it hit, it would leave Dublin in ruins. By 4 p.m. on Easter Monday, British forces had secured Kingsbridge Station. Before long, trains would be arriving every 15 to 20 minutes, disgorging more British troops into the heart of Dublin, ready to fight. Speaking of which, it's probably time to clarify exactly what we mean when we say British. Although it makes for an easier story just saying the Irish did this and the British did that, the reality is that the forces involved in putting down the rising were filled with Irishmen. For the first few days of the fighting, nearly every soldier on the British side was Irish-born. Plenty were Catholics, and some were even Home Rulers who'd been convinced by John Redmond to enlist when war broke out. But even when we get to Wednesday and ethnic Brits start arriving, they weren't exactly the black and tans. Most of those who fought against the rebellion were working-class teenagers who'd completed basic training and were en route to fight in World War I when they were suddenly diverted to Dublin. So while we'll probably just keep saying the British for narrative ease, bear in mind that these aren't the feared, bloodthirsty units of the Irish War of Independence, but a bunch of young men, many of them Irish-born, engaging in their first ever battle. And what a battle it would turn out to be. As night fell across Dublin on Easter Monday, parts of the city centre were already on fire. With the gasworks occupied by rebels, lights had also gone out across the south, plunging swaths of the city into darkness. The first instances of looting were recorded. Bad as that day and night must have seemed, though, it was only as the week properly began that the violence really kicked into gear. Tuesday dawned on a Dublin filled with British soldiers determined to flush the rebels out of their positions. In some cases, this was done with ease. After taking the Shellbourne Hotel, for example, they were able to begin machine gunning the rebels on St. Stephen's Green.
This is tense. Obviously, it's going to be intense, but very well done video.
Taking the Shellbourne Hotel, for example, they were able to begin machine gunning the rebels on St. Stephen's Green. Not long after, City Hall fell. But in most places, those involved in the rising held fast, and in some cases, they inflicted heavy British losses. The most storied of these happened on that Wednesday at Mount Street Bridge. There, a small number of Irish volunteers held back 1,750 British soldiers for hours, inflicting massive casualties, equivalent to nearly half of all British deaths during the rising. Unfortunately, it was strong defences like these that pushed the Brits to take their most drastic step of all. The artillery assault began at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, with an 18-pounder blasting rebel positions in the Phipsborough area. Within hours, the gunboat HMY Helga had appeared on the River Liffey and fired its opening salvos. But it would be on Wednesday that the shelling really took off. That day, with the whole of Dublin now under martial law, the Helga, the HMY Seahawk, and British field guns trained on Liberty Hall, and the GPO let rip. The result was a deadly rain falling not just on rebel positions, but on the homes of civilians. Scores of ordinary Dubliners were killed in that downpour of lead as their city transformed into a war zone. A war zone in which food was fast running out, looters were smashing shops, and stray bullets were cutting people down on the streets. Horrifically though, not all civilian deaths would be accidents. That Wednesday, the Irish pacifist Francis Sheehy-Skeffington and 2 pro-British journalists who'd been mistaken for rebels were shot by firing squad without even a military trial. It was a grotesque moment amid the violence, a war crime with no rhyme and no reason. Sadly, it would just be the first. The last 3 days of the Easter Rising played out as a slow, bloody tragedy. Thursday dawned with fires burning out of control across the city, fires that would by Friday have engulfed the GPO building. As rebels tried to flee the flames, they were gunned down by machine guns. Thursday, too, saw the rebels' command lines cut. Before the day was out, the British had seized enough of the city centre to even begin emergency food distribution to civilians. Not that taking down the last rebel positions would be easy. Over in North King Street, Ned Daly's men so effectively pinned the British down that it took them 2 days to gain control of a mere 150 yards. The Rising's leaders, meanwhile, issued a statement from their holdout on Moore Street declaring that while the volunteers had lost the physical fight, they may win it in death. To which the British replied that death was absolutely what they intended to give them. The Rising's endgame on Saturday was less a battle than it was a series of atrocities. In Moore Street, British shot dead civilians fleeing their homes, wrongly believing them to be rebel soldiers. On North King Street,
I did not, guys. I guess I was stupid for not imagining it would be like this, but I didn't picture like huge random artillery bombardments. I'm shocked by just how warlike it is. That kind of sounds stupid coming out of my mouth, but It's just my thoughts.
The South Staffordshire Regiment conducted a house-by-house massacre, shooting and bayoneting to death 15 innocent men. Facing a fast-mounting civilian death toll, the Rising's leaders finally voted to surrender at 11:15 a.m. By now, whole parts of Dublin were in ruins, blown up, burned down, shot full of holes. Some 485 people were dead, over half of them civilians, with another 2,500 wounded. 64 rebels had died, along with 116 British soldiers. Most depressingly, among the dead lay 40 children. Despite the Saturday surrender, it took until Monday morning for the last pockets of resistance to stand down. By that time, the British had taken over 1,000 people prisoner, and there were no plans for lenient treatment of any kind. As far as London was concerned, the rebels weren't just rebels, they were traitors. People who'd given Fair Albion a kicking when she was busy engaged in a brutal European war. Beginning on May the 2nd, a series of court-martials were held to try everyone suspected of taking part in the rebellion. In all, 90 death sentences were handed down, while most, like that famously handed to female fighter Constance Markievicz, would be commuted. 14 would not. The very next day, Pearce, McDonough, and Clarke became the first to be executed, shot for their roles. Over the next 9 days, more people would be sent to their deaths, culminating on May the 12th with James Connolly and Mac Diarmada. By now, Connolly, who'd been wounded in the fighting, was so weak that they had to tie him to a chair just so they could execute him. The last to die was Roger Casement, separately hanged in London on August the 3rd. That done, the British turned to general reprisals. Strange as it is to think now, at the moment the rebels surrendered, most people in Dublin didn't think that they were heroes, but a bunch of idiots. The Irish press portrayed them as an embarrassment, comparing the Rising to the bravery of the near 600 Irishmen who died on World War I's front lines in the same period. Locals too thought they were fools. As they were arrested, the Rising's leaders were jeered in the streets. So what changed? The simple answer? The British were even bigger idiots. In the aftermath, over 3,400 people were arrested across Ireland, many of them.
I wonder if many in Ireland were doing that out of fear of the British, or maybe they legitimately thought that. I really just don't know the dynamics of. I want to make sure when I'm getting into a topic that I know so little about, that I make sure you guys know, the comments I make are done with a bit of ignorance. Understand that. So I'm trying to just kind of separate it into two sides and like two fronts, this side for, this side against. But there seems to be a bunch of people with different ideas in the same place. And it's hard to tell whether anger at the Irish uprisers is legitimate or fear of England. I really don't know. I'm learning.
Brutalized, most of them with no connection to the violence. Ian McNeill, who'd tried to stop the Rising, was sentenced to life in prison. In Cork, which had remained peaceful, thousands upon thousands of homes were raided. Combined with the cruelty of some of the executions, this harsh British crackdown managed to change the narrative. Suddenly, the men behind the Rising no longer looked so foolish. Instead, they began to look like prophets, people who'd seen the cruelties that British rule had been capable of and acted. And this shift in perspective would have profound consequences. By 1917, Home Rule as a concept was dead, as was any lingering sympathy for Britain. In its place, a new republicanism was on the rise, one fed by the injustices that followed the Rising, one that would soon lead to the Irish War of Independence. After all that death and bloodshed then, what are we to make of the Easter Rising? Well, on one hand, it remains one of the defining moments in Irish history, a moment when the blood spilt by a few fighters birthed a new, muscular strain of Irish nationalism, one that would quickly lead to the establishment of the Irish Free State. On the other hand, though, it's also remarkable for how unlikely it all was. By rights, the 1916 Easter Rising should be considered a failure, a badly designed, badly executed plan that only got as far as it did thanks to British bungling. And yet, in that failure, millions of people managed to find something, a noble cause, an idea to hold on to, an idea that eventually came to define what a free Ireland could be. Perhaps this, then, is the way we should think of the Easter Rising, as something equal parts historical event and legend. Because, failure or not, there's one thing we can say for certain about the century-old rebellion. Without it, the histories of both Ireland and its old overlord Britain would look very, very different today. So I do hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.
Thank you for making. That was crazy. Yeah, just getting my foot in the door on this topic. I won't judge the entire conflict on one video, although it is, the first bit of knowledge I'm learning about it. You guys are great in the comments for any of the questions or whatnot I had. Awesome. Great channel. See you guys next time. I hope you're doing well. If not, keep your chin up. You'll be good soon. Don't worry. See ya.